The world is an odd place, full of mystery. Never let anyone tell you different. Most people are not fortunate enough to see the strange and surreal things that prowl our world. They live out their mundane yet pleasant lives, unaware of just how strange this planet really is. Its many secrets are lost on them, and I suspect as time marches on, more and more will be lost. I can't say for sure if the mysterious things that dwell in the quiet corners of this world are dying, or if they've simply found new places to hide. I know they aren't gone yet. People still meet them every day. And yet, with cell phones in the pocket of just about every person on the planet, so little exists to document them, and what is out there is buried beneath the clutter. It wasn't always like that. In a time not so long ago, civilizations crossed paths with the mysterious more often than it might care to, and in its foolish stubbornness, it often failed to hold its own when those things came with a thirst for blood. God only knows how many true tales have faded into legend, or how many legends have fallen into complete obscurity. I know of one that has, and it took place right here on American soil, in a little Oklahoma town called Franklin. I myself have never had the good fortune, or cruel misfortune, of seeing the twisted things that lurk in the hidden places of the world. My life has been a mundane one. My great-grandmother, Ruth Thompson, on the other hand, lived in far more interesting times. Back during the 1890s, she was one of only 200 folks living in Franklin, Oklahoma. I've done a fair bit of research on the town during my years. Nowadays, it's called something else entirely, and there's few records that hint at the truth of what happened out there. I doubt many people live to remember that day, save for my Grandma Ruth and a handful of others. And time has long since sent all of them to their graves. I imagine they mostly took any account of the woman on the pale horse with them. Mostly. Grandma Ruth only ever told me about the woman on the pale horse once. It was late in the evening at some family gathering. It must have been the late 60s, but I can't recall the exact year. I know it was close to Halloween because I remember that the decorations were out. I myself was quite young at the time, barely older than 10, and I'd caught her sitting out on the back porch, getting away from the noise of the rest of the family. She was a truly ancient woman, having surpassed 90, and yet lost none of her wit. Sitting on the table beside her was a half-empty glass of gin and tonic, and she stared wistfully out at the twilight sky, barely noticing me at first. And when she did see me, she smiled and invited me to take a seat beside her. "Well, hello there, Audrey," she'd said, her voice warm and raspy. "Lovely night out tonight, isn't it?" "Yes, Grandma," I'd replied, and watched as she'd taken a sip of her gin and tonic. She laughed at my robotic response, and took no offense to the fact that I really didn't have much to talk about with her. Instead, she defaulted to the regular questions one might ask a kid around that time. "Are you excited for Halloween?" Now that was a question I could get invested in. "I am," I said. "I'm going to be a bat this year. Me and my friends are going to sleep over and we're going to tell ghost stories." "Goodness, ghost stories," she said, half amused by the prospect. "You like ghost stories, do you?" I nodded. "I do," I replied. And then I asked the question. A question that began what I can only describe as a lifelong obsession. "Do you know any ghost stories, Grandma?" I remember how her expression darkened, as if my words had stirred up an old memory. She was silent for a moment, as she stared out at the horizon, thinking something over, but I had no idea what. "I know a few," she finally said. "I suppose I lived through one, actually. I don't suppose I ever told you about the woman on the pale horse, have I?" I remember the surge of elation that had coursed through me. A genuine ghost story from Grandma Ruth? What a treat, right? No, never, I replied. Her grim expression remained, and looking back on it, I'm sure I saw her hesitating before she finally sighed. Well, I suppose I ought to share it sometime, she finally said. And as we sat on the back porch on that cold autumn night, she told me what she'd seen that fateful day. Ruth Thompson was born to a well-to-do family in the town of Franklin back in 1876. It was her home for most of her early life, and she often spoke fondly of it later in her life. She never said why she'd left. I suspect that she feared what others might think of her if she did. She was 16 in the summer of 1892 when the fog rolled in, and she told me she saw it coming from her window. It looked down on the main street of that little town, and from her vantage point, she could see the farms and trees that stretched off into the distance. She hadn't thought too much of it. Why would she? Fog was fog. Nothing overly sinister, and nothing she thought she needed to worry about. She told me that she had seen the rider in the distance, on the road into town, although, much like the fog, they carried no significance to her at the time, and so she paid them no mind and continued about her business. She had been outside, enjoying a book beneath her favorite tree, when the rider made it to town. She was a strange sight, pale as death with long, flowing white hair to match. She wore a simple white dress and a rancher's hat that made it impossible to see her eyes, and the horse she rode looked starved. She described it to me as pale and bony. Even from a distance, she could see its ribs against the creature's skin. Its hide was a sickly white, and it looked ready to collapse. It trotted down Main Street, carrying the strange woman into town. Normally, folks might not have paid her much mind, yet there was something about her that drew the eye. Ruth described it as a magnetism. Others on the street turned and stopped what they were doing to watch her as she passed, eyes fixated on her even after she left them behind. Ruth recalled seeing only one person actually dare to approach the stranger on the pale horse. The town's sheriff, a man by the name of James Wallace. Her description of Wallace was that he was a notoriously pig-headed man, but one whose loyalties were unquestionable. He truly cared for the town of Franklin and its people, or at least Ruth believed he did. The woman was near the end of the main street, not too far from where Ruth herself sat and read, when Sheriff Wallace approached her on foot. Her sickly horse stopped in its tracks, and the woman stared down at him. For a moment, both were silent as they regarded each other. It was Wallace who broke that silence. "That horse of yours looks awful ill, missy," he said. "How long you been riding for?" "Some time now," the woman replied. Her voice was low and sultry, "and I've got some way still to go before the fog has passed." "That's so. And whereabouts are you headed?" "As far as I need to go, until the fog has passed." Wallace scoffed at that. "Well, missy, if you're looking for a rest, there's rooms down at the inn just down the street. I might be able to get some feed for that horse of yours if you're so inclined. Damn thing looks ready to keel over and die."
"That's a kind offer, but she'll be fine. Best we not linger in the worst of the fog. Best you not linger either."
She looked back, far into the distance where the fog crept inwards towards Franklin. "And why's that?" Wallace asked. The woman didn't reply at first. She only stared out at the coming fog.
"Best not to linger,"
she repeated.
"Indoors might be safe, perhaps. What's coming won't be pleasant."
"And what is coming?" Wallace asked. Now he, too, was looking out at the fog. The woman looked at him and scratched the bony neck of her horse. A tiny smile crossed her lips. "Stay here and find out," she said. "But I really must be moving on." With that, she tugged at the reins of her horse and coaxed it away from Sheriff Wallace. He watched her as she left, her half-dead animal leading her out of town almost as quickly as she'd arrived. She couldn't have been there for longer than 20 minutes, and yet she'd left an impression. Grandma Ruth had watched as that strange woman on her pale horse quickly became little more than a spot in the distance, and behind her, the fog came ever closer. Perhaps the pale rider may have quickly faded into a strange memory, were it not for what came only a half hour after she'd left. Ruth had stayed beneath her tree, drawn back to her book when the second rider came. Unlike the woman on the pale horse, this man was no stranger. Ruth didn't know him well, but she recognized his face. Samuel Jones, one of Wallace's younger deputies. Jones rode into town from the fog as if Lucifer himself was on his tail, and before he'd even made it halfway across the main street, the poor boy toppled off his horse, which kept on running long after the boy had fallen. Wallace had briefly gone inside after the rider on the pale horse had left, but when Jones made it into town, he stepped out again, along with several of his own. The boy scrambled through the dust like an animal, shrieking and sobbing as he scrambled towards Wallace and the other deputies, babbling like a child. Wallace was the first to reach him and help the man to his feet. Jones collapsed against him, gripping his shirt with white-knuckled hands, as tears of blood streamed from his eyes. "Fog," he rasped. "The fog! Fog! The fog!" "Hold on, boy. What about the goddamn fog?" Wallace tried to say, but he barely even finished his sentence over the mad babbling of Samuel Jones. "Can't stay. Can't. No more, please. No more fog. No!" His screams had drawn Ruth away from her book, and as the fog drifted deeper into Franklin, she'd stood by her tree and watched as Wallace had pushed Jones into the arms of one of his other deputies. His men looked outright terrified. The fog was on the edge of town, and Wallace stared into it once more, as did my grandmother. It wasn't long before it would envelop the town of Franklin, and a sense of deep unease permeated the air. "Sheriff, might be best we get indoors," a man had said, but Wallace had ignored him. "No, I'd say we're good right here," he'd said. He'd watched the fog warily as it drifted down the end of Main Street. Just why Sheriff Wallace held his ground isn't exactly clear to me. Grandma Ruth called him pig-headed. I imagine that had something to do with it. Perhaps in the face of something unknown creeping toward the town he was charged with protecting, he thought it only proper to face it head-on. Perhaps he underestimated what was truly coming for him, or thought there was something his simple mind could comprehend within the fog. Either way, his fate was the same. As the fog rolled in and overtook the town of Franklin, he remained steadfast, sending only a few of his deputies inside with Jones, as he drew nearer to the fog with a few of his men. Grandma Ruth had watched them as the fog had drifted into her little town. She did not understand just what lay ahead, but she knew. "I could sense it," she'd said to me all those years later on the back porch. "Something thick and heavy in the air. Presence. Something vast. Something real and terrible. I could feel it in a way I'm not sure I can fully describe. And I knew I wanted to be away from it. As far away as I could get. Even if it was just inside." As the fog overtook the town of Franklin, Ruth abandoned her spot by the tree and headed inside. Through the window, she could still see the others on the street, and they had all stopped to look out at the swirling fog that washed over them. In a matter of minutes, Franklin was overtaken by a wash of white, and those who remained in its streets were left as nothing but pale shadows as the deep fog set in. Safe inside her house, Ruth had looked out at the town and saw those specters in the street, looking around in quiet curiosity, and for a few moments there was silence. Ruth told me that she did not know who shot first. The silence had lasted long enough that she was almost ready to dismiss the dread she felt in her soul. And when the carnage began, it was sudden. A deep, primal scream sounded from somewhere in the distance. An inhuman shriek that she felt in her very bones. She could not tell who began the carnage. It was further near the end of the street, but the sudden gunshots and cries of men and women on the street became a chorus that caused her to flinch. She could see flashes of light within the fog, the flash of muzzles, as they ignited and delivered death. She could see the shapes and shadows of bodies in the haze, rushing about, falling and dying in the horrible chaos. She stumbled back away from the window, lest stray shots find their mark in her skull. Yet even away from the window, she could still hear the sounds of carnage that had quickly overtaken the streets. For what seemed like forever, those who had been out and exposed when the fog had hit were taken by a ravenous madness, and she could hear every bloody detail of the slaughter. She could hear the mad laughter as gunshots and screams rose from the street. And while the gunshots were quick to stop, the screams were not. Ruth crouched down on the ground, hands over her head, and eyes squeezed shut, as the people of Franklin tore each other to bloody ribbons. She could hear the voice of Sheriff Wallace, screaming as he died. The slaughter seemed to last forever, and even as it ended, the screams of the dying lingered on. Ruth sat quietly on the floor, waiting until the screams had died down some, before she dared to look out the window once more. The fog was still there, although it looked thinner than before. It shrouded the worst of the carnage, although Ruth had seen enough. She could see the bodies in the street, lifeless human shapes with blood seeping into the dirt. Some of them still squirmed and screamed. They tried to stand only to collapse, as organs spilled out of their torn and mangled bodies. On the main street, she could see Sheriff Wallace among the victims, alive in only the strictest definition of the sense. He lay on his side, still breathing and weakly screaming. Something had torn open the man's stomach, spilling his entrails out onto the dirt road. Ruth stared down at him from her window, watching as he struggled to rise and failed each time. Through the fading fog, he was the only one she could see and recognize, and for a moment, she considered trying to help the dying man. Although, if such a thing were ever even an option, she waited far too long to attempt to do so. In the distance, she could hear the tap of hooves on the dirt, and as she watched by the window, she could see the shadow of a figure in the fog. As if they had never left, the woman on the emaciated, pale horse walked through the haze. Her skeletal mount paraded past some of the corpses, slowing down as it walked amongst them. It paused before the twitching, squirming body of Sheriff Wallace, before looking down at him. Its narrow head lowered down towards his exposed entrails, and she watched as its mouth opened, splitting far wider than a horse's mouth should have, and exposing jagged teeth, as it began to consume the spilled entrails of the dying sheriff. Ruth could only watch as that pale creature consumed the flesh of the dying sheriff, gnawing at him until his body went still, and its rider looked down on him, stoic and silent. Their head turned and looked up toward the window, up towards Ruth Thompson. And at last she could see their eyes, burning pale yellow with an unnatural light. She could see the twisted smile of the woman, cruel and mocking as she stared up at her, seeing into her very soul, until in her terror she hid herself away from the window. She didn't look out again. Not even as she heard the hooves moving further away. She didn't move again for the remainder of the day. Not until the fog had cleared and the survivors began to emerge to clean up the carnage that had been left in its wake. And even then, she did not remain in Franklin for long after that. The fog had come once, after all. It could come again. And Ruth would not be there if it ever did. It has been a long time since that cool autumn night, when Grandma Ruth told me about the Pale Rider who came to Franklin, Oklahoma. Perhaps some might believe it was simply a ghost story, told by an old woman to entertain a young child. But even then, there was something that made me wonder if her tale was much more than that. Something in her eyes, perhaps. Something in the way she told me what she saw. Something that told me it was more than just a story. And it was that something which made me need to know the truth. Grandma Ruth died not long after that night. Peaceful and at an age any of us would aspire to live to. She took the last memories of Franklin with her into her grave. And for me, I've searched for answers ever since. I found Franklin, Oklahoma. As I said, it goes by a different name now, and I doubt any of its current residents are aware of just what happened on that day in 1892. What records I've found mention a sickness that came into town that year. Just what the sickness was, the records don't say. Yet in such a short time, it claimed almost half of Franklin's small population, including its sheriff at the time, James Wallace. No one remembers what happens on that forgotten day, and I might well be the only one who knows. And if I am, then it is my duty to ensure that no one ever forgets.
Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.